Hey everyone, it's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Scandinavian Defense. Alright, here we are at the chessboard. So the Scandinavian Defense is another king's pawn opening where white starts with e4, and black responds by challenging this pawn immediately with pawn to d5. There are a couple other king's pawn openings where black tries to challenge this e-pawn, for example the French defense, where black's going to play d5 next turn, and the Caro-Kann defense, same idea, c6 and then d5, but the Scandinavian defense, black does it directly. Now the main downside of black playing this move right away is that white can take this pawn, and white almost always does take that pawn, otherwise black's just going to get a better version of one of those other two openings I just mentioned. But after white takes this pawn, black can't really maintain their foothold in the center with a pawn. They've succeeded in getting rid of white's strong central pawn for now, but after this queen gets kicked away, white will often just replace it with another pawn in the center by playing d4, and white once again has a space advantage. This right here is one of the biggest main lines of the Scandinavian defense. We see that black had to move the queen twice in the opening, and black usually chooses a5 for this queen because it's kind of hard for the queen to keep getting harassed there, and it can eventually swing back to c7, which is a more normal square for that queen. Black needs to be careful not to let the queen just get harassed. For example, after knight c3, a lot of beginners give a move like this because it's check, but white can just block this check, and white's going to gain yet another tempo on this queen by developing that knight and attacking that queen at the same time. White's getting all their pieces into the game, and black keeps moving that queen. Not what you want to be doing. But after queen takes d5, knight c3, queen to a5, and after white plays d4, things aren't as bad as they look for black. You might wonder, who wants to play an opening where you have to move the queen multiple times and your opponent gets a space advantage anyway? It seems kind of contrary to the opening principles, but black has lots of open lines to develop. So let's take a look. Knight f6. White will usually play knight to f3. Very normal developing moves. c6. Black knows the queen's going to have to swing back here. For example, after this bishop comes to d2, black's going to want a safe square for that queen to get out of the line of sight of that bishop. So c6, white can aggressively develop this bishop to c4. Black can play bishop to f5 and develop their bishop as well. Bishop d2, bishop d2. Black's going to open the path for their other bishop. And now white can certainly try to make some discovered attack on the queen. For example, knight d5 attacking the queen, but now the queen can simply drop back to d8 and black has everything defended. After white plays a move like queen e2, black can certainly retreat this queen now, or black sometimes even plays bishop to b4. And this position is a good illustration of what usually happens in the Scandinavian defense. From a classical principles perspective, white's doing pretty well here. White has a slight lead in development, and white has the lone pawn here in the center, so white has a space advantage. But black was, for the most part, able to develop pretty actively. All their pieces here are standing pretty well. Black really has no poorly placed pieces. This knight's going to find a nice home here on d7, and black can go ahead and get castled. So it's not at all easy for white to make black pay for making these queen moves in the opening. Black's willing to waste some time making those queen moves while white develops, because black knows that he's opening those lines for his pieces. In this particular position, white usually castles queenside. Black plays knight b to d7. And now white can play a3 and secure the bishop pair for themselves, because black's going to have to exchange off this bishop. But after queen to c7, black's position is very solid. So that's a good illustration of how these lines usually go in the mainline Scandinavian. Let's talk about some alternatives both players have. So the queen doesn't have to go to a5 here. Another popular move is queen to d6. The queen's in a little more danger of being harassed here, but moves like knight b5 and knight e4 aren't productive right away. So black's hoping their queen can exert a little more pressure on the position, a little more influence by remaining closer to the center. White usually plays d4, the typical move to grab central space. Black can play knight to f6, knight to f3. Now black usually takes time to play a6 or c6 here, just to take this b5 square under control, because that can be annoying later, attacking that queen. And white has a few options here. Bishop c4, that was the move we saw from the mainline Scandinavian, but here black has an idea to play b5, kick that bishop, and very quickly fianchetto this bishop and exert a lot of influence there in the center. That's one way the game can go. White's most ambitious attempt to really try to punish this queen for being here out in the open is probably to play g3, intending to play bishop f4. And here black can play bishop g4 and pin this knight, bishop to g2, and now knight c6. Black's putting some pressure on this d-pawn. Black might at some point be threatening to remove the defender and then win a pawn here. It's not going to work right away though, because white would be able to remove this defender of the queen with this bishop. Just for example, let's say white were to castle here and black tried to do this. Bishop takes, and now black tried to win this pawn. It looks good at first, but white can remove the defender here of the queen, and this would not be good for black. This comes with check, and black would end up losing that queen. So it doesn't work right away. It might be an idea later down the road for black, though, to put pressure on that d-pawn. Instead, after white castles, black usually castles themselves, putting that rook on the d-file, adding even more pressure against this d-pawn. And now we can see how black benefits from keeping this queen closer to the center, where she can help out in the action here, adding to the pressure of d4. And it turns out if white does play bishop f4 here, this queen can come to b4 and counterattack the b-pawn. Black is a little slower in developing their kingside pieces in this line, but black still has a lot of very active pieces here and some pressure on the white position. Another third move for black, after e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to c3, developing a piece and attacking that queen. Some players just play queen to d8, making sure the queen can't be harassed any further. But then, of course, white still plays d4. The queen is certainly safe on d8, but this is considered a more passive option for black. After queen takes d5, white has an alternative here as well. We've been looking at knight c3, which is by far white's most popular move, but knight f3 is another very interesting option for white, not attacking that queen right away, and white's reserving the right to play c4 at some point instead of blocking in this pawn with the knight. And this actually, I think, gives white a nice position if black doesn't adapt to this plan. For example, if black tries to play similarly to what we've seen, knight f6, d4, something like bishop f5, now c4, queen a5 check, knight c3, c6, and now something like maybe bishop d2 and the queen comes back to c7. I feel like this is somewhat of an improvement for white to be able to get this c-pawn out from c2, put it in the center, and control more space. So if you're looking to catch your opponent off guard in the Scandinavian, this knight f3 option might be worth looking into. Now, black certainly has some ways to play against this. Black will usually pin this knight very early and play bishop g4, for example. One of the main lines goes knight to f6, d4, bishop to g4, bishop e2, and now knight c6. And here black will often castle queenside, letting this rook help out when it comes to d8, pressuring this d-pawn. The knight and queen are attacking the d-pawn. This bishop could remove the defender at some point. So black's kind of adapted to white's setup and just decided to put a lot of pressure against that d4 pawn. White often plays h3 here, kind of forcing the bishop to make a decision. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now queen to d7. By the way, queen takes d4 does not work. Again, because of this removing the defender tactic, white can remove the defender of that queen and then win the queen next turn. That's not what black wants. But after queen d7, we see it's hard for white to really push c4 because their d-pawn is under attack. One of the main lines is c3, and now black can play e5, a move they would rarely get to play in a main line Scandinavian with knight c3, and again, black's putting lots of pressure on this center. So we've taken a look at both sides' alternatives here on move 3, where white can play moves besides knight c3, and if white does play knight c3, black can play a couple moves besides queen a5. Black actually has an alternative on move 2. After white takes this pawn here, black does not actually have to recapture right away. Black sometimes plays knight to f6, hoping to capture with the knight so they don't have to move their queen multiple times in the opening. Now at first it looks like this doesn't work because white can play c4, just defending this pawn with a pawn, and it looks like white's up a pawn for good here. But it turns out it's surprisingly dangerous if white tries to be greedy here and stay up a pawn. Black can play c6, trying to tear down this structure, and if white exchanges off, white is certainly up a pawn, but black has two pieces developed, white has none, and now white cannot play d4, so black has lots of compensation here. For example, knight to f3, e5. And if white plays d3 to stop black from pushing forward with e4, now this bishop develops very actively, and this d-pawn is actually very weak. Black's probably going to double on the d-file with their queen and rook. This knight could come to b4 at some point if white doesn't prevent that, and this pawn's going to come under heavy fire. This is a backwards pawn on this semi-open file that black has, and black has a big lead in development in some of these lines as well. So instead, after knight f6, white usually does not try to retain this pawn. They're going to give it back and let that knight take, but this is going to come with some issues of itself for black. There's certainly some very ambitious ways for white to try to play against this. I personally prefer just playing knight f3, let them take here if they want to with the knight. And now you can play d4, and probably c4 soon, and instead of moving the queen multiple times in the opening, black is going to end up moving their knight multiple times in the opening. They had to move it again to capture this pawn, and they're going to have to move it again after you play c4. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to go to chesspathways.com and get signed up there. Only takes a couple seconds. I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up, and make sure you never miss any new content. Thank you so much, and I will see you soon.